Okay, I have a question to Polly. Is about what are you, I don't know if you're following the recent aid programs targeting arts in Mozambique, so whether you can set up a parallel, but sorry for my economic bias, but as you mentioned, donors versus recipient and all this management that needs to be done, we have seen Norway, that is a major donor, a major contributor, acknowledging the odious dimension of the aid and the attached credit lines, and because of that they cancel some of the debt. Because when they give support, sometimes there are some strings, sometimes there are some conditionality that is to buy to Norwegian suppliers. So I don't know, as you know, I don't know the arts and educational programs, but I wonder whether you find this sort of issues nowadays in the practices of our days, because it's very unique what Norway did, and very few donors acknowledge this economic, this strategic conditionality attached to aid.
Hi, Egeac. I don't know if I understand your question. I don't know if I understand your question. Was it about whether there's a condition attached to the aid, or specifically about Norway?
No, Norway was just an example.
Yeah.
But I know
I know the Norway case that they acknowledge the odious dimension of the aid that they provide.
The audience dimension.
Odious, yes. But I don't know the case of Mozambique, and that is a major recipient from aid flows.
Yeah.
And I don't know the reality in this nowadays. I don't know if you're covering as well, if you're setting up a sort of a parallel with what happened in the 70s and 80s, and if you know the reality of nowadays.
I don't know the specific project that you're referring to. I know that Norway funded a lot of the bursary projects, interestingly, that took artists to Cuba, for example. So this aid was used, this sort of Scandinavian aid was used to support some of these bursaries. And certainly there were conditions attached at that moment. I'm familiar with some of the projects that are happening in Mozambique in terms of contemporary art, but the funding aspect of them is not something that I've covered particularly. But certainly with this move towards a sort of neoliberal economy in Mozambique, there was certainly a kind of diversification of art practice and the possibilities for art practice, and of course that, the two are kind of work together in a certain respect, although there is always that resistance to whatever kind of ideological model is in place.
Red Africa, this is the main umbrella under which this program has been thought. As you have already mentioned, Mark, it has also various meanings. And to that I would like to, thinking about on your own contributions now to the panel, how many Red Africas there could also be. So the conflicts that could also take place inside, utopian moments towards or in Africa. For instance, how would you relate the scholarships program in the Soviet Union to the Godard and Jean Rouch in Mozambique? What could be the links? What would be the contradictions? This would be a general issue, because I think this would also would help us complexify a little bit this idea of, the utopian socialists and the complexity of friendships, complicities, affective communities, to use the word also present in the program. So this would be a kind of a common question for all of you, if you feel like it. The second would be, and I think this was kind of implicit in some of your interventions, but how far this friendship with various practices and various experiences, connotations, could also be understood as a form of aid to development, and how these modernizing ventures, it could also be understood as a form of a new form of colonialism, or as Anna was just evoking, as really the experience of Bush, how much also the locals were able to appropriate some of the things that were being brought to them. So, general question, how much these friendships or programs could also be understood as forms of, new forms of colonialism?
Complicated, deep questions. I'll jump in. On the first one about the connections, just with it's not answering the question exactly, but for example, your question about what might connect Jean Rouche's experiments and the scholarship program, but just to point out that in a way, an exhibition like that, or a research exhibition, has a kind of methodology where it doesn't really answer questions, it sort of sets them up, and in a way, your question then that comes back is really exactly the next stage, is what are those connections? I don't think I have a particular answer. What we did when we developed the project was kind of think of work that would connect together and speak. So works would speak to each other in different ways, and then maybe facilitate other kinds of conversation like we're having here, or other exhibitions. So myself, I don't particularly see a connection between those two particular projects. Others might do it, but that's in a way, that's in a sense what I think research curating is all about, as Ângela was talking about. The notion of research, you come back to asking certain questions and finding them.
I think they're really useful questions. I mean, for me, I don't know what you think, Ângela, but this sort of relationship that is set up of Africa as being a student, or Africa as, you know, the African subject as the pupil and the European as the teacher. You know, this kind of relationship is kind of enduring, and you can certainly see it as a kind of neo-colonial kind of hangover. I think that kind of model of you know, it's a power model, isn't it, of you know, Africa needs to learn from the Europeans, and you know, of course, this is a kind of colonial approach. So I think the parallel is there to an extent. I mean, for me, I know that Godard, and maybe Ângela, I'm sure knows a lot more about this than I do, but I understand that Godard proposed an idea to Frelimo that involved training people to produce their own news programs. Is that right? Mm-hmm. And that Frelimo was resistant to this, and they wanted to be in control of the production process, and that was part of the conflict. And for me, that raises quite interesting questions about kind of authorship and the role of kind of creativity within that kind of moment, that early moment of independence, and what Frelimo, how Frelimo kind of understood creativity. And I think Professor Jacques Cavarino can speak to this with a lot more authority than I can, but so those questions I think are important, and that sense of, you asked about whether it was understood as a neo-colonial intervention, the bursaries, and yes, there was certainly that critique, and I know that a lot of writers recently have been talking about the kind of continuities between the Estado Novo project and the you know, this kind of educational programs that intended to produce the new man, and you know, you can find these sort of parallels there. And, yeah, if you
Got no answers to that question, but I'd like a go at it. I don't really know the contours of how the Godard thing failed. I have suspicions, and there's a lot of myth around it. So, you know, and I work a lot with myth. I'm not, you know, as an artist, I'm allowed to, and so, yeah, I'm not sure why that particular project fell apart. With Rouche, I'm more clear, as I said before. I think that just the wave the necessity of the country as the war entered probably changed the needs on the ground. But what I think is interesting about what you're pointing to, and I think maybe what the question was pointing to, is actually at the core, more at the core of this particular curatorial project, and that's what interested me in the beginning and still holds a certain interest here. And I was trying to kind of rethink the conversation we had in the London opening. I'm not sure whether you were there, Polly, but because this show actually touches on something which has been forbidden ground to a certain point. You know, the West always saw, during the Cold War, always saw the Russian input into Africa as a political move, you know, kind of gaining ground where they were being forced to leave ground, you know, and so because of that, it gained an enormous amount of bad press, so to speak. I'm talking very colloquially, but as I said, I'm giving it a go. I don't have such a clear idea about it. But so I think the project of the Russian cooperation in Africa, and I don't think that applies only to the post-independence. I think it dates right back to the liberation struggles, you know, when the arms were being supplied and there were already people going to study and being offered bursaries. So there was an educational thing together with a military thing, together with an economic thing. And I think politically it was all well linked. But the thing that interested me was more to try and demystify the bad press that this whole program had received from the point of view of more of a Western recipient of news, you know, and a Western educated person, which is what I was, you know, and also in the light of the fact that, of course, the whole, you know, Soviet project was such a failure, and it brought with it such enormous social and economic problems in itself. So that kind of conspired to prove the evilness of the socialist friendship. And of course, socialist friendship is such an ironic statement because as Nadine so clearly pointed, it was often and most often than not friendship at all and not very friendly at all. It was quite aggressive, very hard, you know, from what one reads, I mean, the Russian input in the African countries often very hard and very unpleasant, as was, I mean, some of the readings that I've done, for example, and that's not specifically to do with Mozambique, but more to do with South Africa, of the training camps, for example, where there's some pretty horrific things were going on, and that was in many ways orchestrated and done under the auspices of the kind of Soviet interference, if you want to call it that. But what interested me, despite all that sort of really quite dark history, was to understand what the roles that were played out at the time, because the fact is that decolonization did happen, the liberation wars did happen, and the Soviet bloc played a very important part in liberating those countries from what we knew was a colonially controlled continent, you know, in the mid-20th century. And I don't think that we'll ever get an answer of good or bad. In a way, it's a bit like what Mark was saying. It's kind of like opening a can of worms that you can see into. So I was interested, for example, in the movie we saw this afternoon, how, because I'd not seen those movies, so it was quite a treat for me, but I expected the first movie about the guy and the pregnant girl to be a lot more tense and a lot more aggressive, because one also hears some incredible stories of how badly Africans were treated, you know, when they were students in the Soviet Union. Yeah, so that's It is a difficult topic for an exhibition to try and answer that question over there. And it's certainly, I don't see it as a kind of redeeming project, but rather than a acknowledgement and problematizing, if that's possible at all. Yeah.
Thanks, Ângela. Yeah, Anna. Yeah.
Say something very quickly. Well, regarding Godard's project, I was just thinking of Margarida Cardoso's film, the Cuxa Canema. She's going to be speaking tomorrow. There is a moment in the film when José Luís Cabasso actually speaks a little bit about the failure of Godard's project, precisely as having to do with the degree of radicality. It was so radical precisely because it was trying to put video, that was the main tool, instead of the Super 8 that Rouge was using, into everyone's hands. Regarding Manuela's questions, and they are at the core, it seems to me, of the curatorial project and of the publication. And the publication is also an important element of this debate and of this discussion, because it helps opening up through different means some of the questions that the exhibition is opening up. And surely many Red Africas, even within, when I was trying to bring into discussion these connections between party and grassroots and communities, and even party and university, and Mozambican students as themselves a sort of intellectual elite in relation to the urban, to the rural areas. You have many degrees of complexity, actually. Even thinking in national terms, not necessarily bringing into the complexity the more transnational level of the collaboration. So yes, sure. And regarding the neo-colonial component of these projects, I agree with Ângela and Polly. I think, the student-teacher, the power dimension of the student-teacher relationship is there, whether it is the Mozambican traveling to Cuba or to the Soviet Union or to East Germany, or precisely when the teachers are being invited. Not only from Europe, it's true, Godard and Rouge were two of them, but there were many, not only doctors and military personnel, but also teachers coming from Cuba, particularly, I think, and other locations. Filmmakers, Brazilian filmmakers traveling to Mozambique after filming the Carnation Revolution in Portugal. So the network is very complex with degrees of several degrees of more or less balanced power relationships, surely, and that's been part of the discussion.
Can I add one? Sorry, no, Nadine, you haven't spoken. Go on.
But if this directly, no. I just wanted to add that I think what also is important to look at what happened at the very same time in other parts. And when the independences that we are focusing on in this table happened in the mid of the 70s, it was already kind of a moment of disillusionment in many other African countries that also had this socialist experiment. So this time of euphoria was already over, and at the very same time we already had the Red Terror in Ethiopia, which we will see in the film tonight. So this various levels of Red Africas at the same time, where on one hand we still have this belief in a more equal society, whereas in other parts we already have the terror and the violent part of it. I think this is also important, and also to see that at the very same time we had also leftist terrorist movements like the RAF in Germany. So you have very different Reds, so to say, and this aspect of disillusionment, I think, is also very helpful to think through all this, when already in the early 80s, artists such as Antonio Ohle, that most of you might know, he decided to go to study in the USA and not in a socialist brother state. So,
Just briefly, Ângela.
Yes. I cannot
No,
say.
it's fine.
Yeah, just to compliment, I think also something that's I've just thought about that may be important, is that one shouldn't just also mix up everything together, because projects are very different. Like, I don't really know enough about the Godard project, and I've never been quite seduced to go and investigate too much about it. But I do know quite a bit about the Jean Rouge project, and I'm not so comfortable with using the kind of neo-colonial tag on Rouge, because I think, and I'm here to be beaten down, but I think the Rouge project was really a well put together, there's a question over there, project. You know, there was a lot of, Rouge had worked extensively in Africa, and also there was, he'd come to Portugal where he'd worked with Jacques Dartuis in the post-revolutionary context. So he'd done some on-the-ground investigation of a revolutionary context. He organizes an arrangement between two universities, so it's done under the auspices of a certain kind of research. He's working with cadres on the ground that are volunteered to him from Frelimo. So there's quite a lot of infrastructural and conceptual political planning in the actual way he conducted his project that, to me, doesn't allow it to be so easily classified, even though he does get criticized for it. But despite the criticism that he receives from the Sun, from what I think, he was actually doing some quite admirable work in the way he constructed the project politically. With Godard, I think, I'm not sure that was going on. So yeah.
We've got the question there, and then we actually have to leave fairly promptly. So if we can take our friend.
Okay, my name is Senna. I'm just talking to say that I'm kind of thankful to Manuela for her question, because it went very close to my question that I'm about to make. I'm not gonna take the way of trying to ask or try to know about how many red Africas are possible, or how many possible narratives can be made from the legacy of the relationship, cultural relationship between Africa and Soviet Union. My question is, the legacy. What's the legacy? The consequences of that relationship that happened once in the past. And if it's not clear yet for you guys to say what's the legacy or what's the consequence of the relationship, if there's a possibility of making a study to focus specifically on the legacy, because we have to try the most we can to avoid that possible neocolonialism, you know. We have to try to avoid that by any means, because it doesn't make sense for the world of today. So, knowing about the legacy, maybe we can avoid that. So if there's a possibility of being clearer about the legacy, I will thank you guys a lot. Thank you.
Well, but thank you for your contribution, but in a way, I would, apart from the fact we're under pressure to finish, I would say two things. One is that actually, I think all the contributions are about the legacy, but they're about research and questions. I don't know that any of us has anything more definite to add at this stage, because it's about opening the questions, and there are two more panels in which these questions can be raised. I mean, I don't know whether any of you have anything more focused to say on that right now, but in a way, we're opening the question of the legacy up for discussion, so you have kind of quite usefully raised the question to carry on to the next session, is how I would
I mean, maybe just one aspect that is interesting. I mean, for the both countries in focus today, like Mozambique and Angola, you can see that on the political level, the parties are still in power, the Frelimo and the MPLA, but they completely changed their. That's the question: did they completely change their politics, their ideology, or if this is also something like a legacy, that kind of a political, transforming, a structure is still in power that claims to be ruling in the state of the art of today, but starting in a time where it had a completely, officially a completely different ideology. So maybe it's not so much like a clear-cut legacy that is visible, but it's also interesting to look at the transformation within politics and societies and how all this kind of, is still there today. And I don't know, when you have a certain idea of how socialism might have looked like, then I would say you find a lot of traces on it, also visually in the cityscape, and also how bureaucracy still works, not only in Africa, but also in Germany, for example. So there is a legacy, but it's maybe some distributed in various levels. Yeah. Just quickly.
I wasn't sure about your question. Are you asking what is the legacy, or are you asking is the legacy good or bad? That's what I'm not sure about. Because if you're asking if the legacy is good or bad, I'd love to hear from you what you think, because I certainly don't have an answer.
Yes, I'm far away from trying to judge the legacy. I'm just trying to know if there's a possibility of defining the Soviet Union intervention or relationship with Africa. Which legacy was left from that relationship?
I think.
Well, I think in concrete terms, monuments, roads, bridges, doctors, teachers, is that what you're asking about, whether there is a legacy? Because there is legacy, concrete legacy. I'm not sure whether you're saying if you're asking us to enunciate the legacy or to give a value judgment on the legacy. That's what I'm not clear about now. I'm not understanding.
I think it seems more
Maybe
factual. That question is complicated, and it is very general. We have been giving several examples of traces, and they include more institutional or even material traces, like monuments and material in museums and the archives, but also affective, more individual or familial or even generational traces, like young people nowadays in Angola, for example. Some of them, they are friends that have parents or grandparents whose second foreign language is Russian instead of, memories of family members having been in some of these geographies. The traces are of several kinds. And as to whether it is good or bad, we have been just opening up precisely that question and the debate around the complexity and variety of connections, some more benign than others, and with better outcomes than others. So there isn't a straightforward answer, I would say.
Yeah, I think it depends where you look, doesn't it? You can look, wherever you kind of look, you can try and excavate these histories or not. And, there's so many different levels you can look at and you can examine, on a very kind of visual, obvious level, there's sort of traces of iconography, but not many. And, going right down to a kind of affective level and a very personal.
But we are also here, and representing another layer of this engagement with notions of friendship, because our interest in this area is also an emotional, affective one. And I think one of the issues that it would be good to carry forward to the discussion is, well, is it possible still to have, as it were, a left-wing emotional politics as opposed to the right-wing? We have a right-wing populist politics now, but all our research here comes out of our own identification with, possibly sometimes nostalgia for, a different kind of ways of relating politically and emotionally, which this period represents. So it's not just a historical exploration, it's also an exploration of the political opportunities we have now. But having said that, we have to finish because the cinema has its own schedule. The cinema's asking us to move along. We have a break before our screening in, I don't know, 10 or 15 minutes. So we need to get a cup of tea or something before we go into and I've even forgotten what our next film is, actually.
Black Sun.
Black Sun, which is a very rare film about Lumumba from the Soviet Union, so you should definitely try and see that if you can. So thank you everybody for coming. Thanks to the panel. We smile for the camera, okay. Oh yes, thanks everyone.
Thank you.
I think that went well.